Miles from the nearest paved road, utterly alone in the unforgiving winter of 2014, Cora Hemsley faced a horrific ultimatum: freeze to death in a drafty, failing cabin, or tear down her entire concept of shelter and rebuild it from the inside out. An unprecedented superstorm had just wiped a massive sector of the Idaho Panhandle completely off the grid, sending temperatures plummeting to 40 below zero. At 95 degrees, the human body begins to fail. By 85, clinical death sets in as organs slow and confusion takes hold. This is the harrowing true story of desperate ingenuity, a testament to the terrifying lengths one human mind will go to survive when both nature and humanity turn lethal. The cabin sat at the end of a forgotten logging road, 14 miles off Highway 95 near Bonners Ferry, Idaho. It was a rugged structure built in the 1970s, purchased by Cora Hemsley and her late husband Arthur as a summer retreat. Cora, a 38-year-old structural engineer from Seattle, had retreated there in late November. She wasn't looking for an adventure. She was looking for a place quiet enough to process her grief. Arthur had died of a sudden aneurysm 6 months prior, and the silence of the pine forests seemed like the only appropriate soundtrack for her mourning. She'd intended to stay through Thanksgiving and leave before the deep winter set in. But nature does not care about human itineraries. It was a Tuesday morning when the old battery-powered Grundig radio crackled to life with a frantic urgency. Cora was at the kitchen sink washing a single coffee mug when the local broadcast out of Sandpoint broke its regular programming. The voice of meteorologist Greg Harrington didn't have its usual polished broadcaster's cadence. It was tight, breathless, and laced with genuine panic. "We are looking at an atmospheric anomaly." Harrington's voice buzzed through the static. "A massive polar vortex is stalling directly over the Panhandle, colliding with a heavy moisture front from the Pacific. The barometric pressure is dropping at a rate I have never seen in my 20-year career. If you are outside, the city limits do not attempt to travel after sundown tonight. We are forecasting up to 8 feet of snow in higher elevations, followed by a sheer temperature drop to negative 40 degrees. This is a mass casualty weather event. You have less than 12 hours to prepare. May God be with you." Cora dropped the mug. It shattered against the cast iron sink, but she didn't even flinch. She felt a strange sensation in her ears, a distinct popping. The atmospheric pressure was already plunging so rapidly that the air in the room was physically changing. She walked to the frosted window and looked out. The sky wasn't its usual winter gray. It was a bruised, sickly purple, heavy and sagging over the tree line. The air was dead still. Not a single pine needle twitched. It was the terrifying holding of breath that precedes a catastrophe. Survival is rarely about grand cinematic heroism. It is almost entirely about mathematics and logistics. Cora's engineer brain immediately began running the calculations. The cabin's insulation was 30 years old and notoriously drafty. Her primary heat source was a large cast iron wood stove in the center of the living room. She looked out the back window toward the woodshed. It was fully stocked. Arthur had been meticulous about ordering 3 cords of seasoned tamarack and fir before he died. But the shed was 80 yards away from the back door. 80 yards. In 2 feet of snow, 80 yards is a chore. In 4 feet, it's an exhausting slog. In 8 feet of snow, with wind chills plummeting to 60 below zero, 80 yards is an impassable frozen desert. If the storm lasted a week, she would never be able to reach the wood. She would burn the furniture, then the books, and then she would sit in the dark and freeze to death. She had roughly 10 hours before the first flakes fell. She couldn't drive out. The logging road was already slick with a layer of black ice from a drizzle the night before, and her old Subaru wouldn't make it up the first incline. She was trapped. Cora pulled on her heavy Carhartt jacket, laced up her boots, and grabbed a heavy-duty plastic sled they usually used for hauling garbage to the end of the driveway. She walked out into the biting air. The cold was already sharpening, biting at the exposed skin of her cheeks. She reached the shed and looked at the massive, perfectly stacked wall of wood. 3 cords. A cord of wood weighs roughly 2 tons. She had to move 6 tons of timber across 80 yards of uneven ground by herself before the sky fell. She loaded the first sled, 10 heavy logs. She dragged it across the frozen earth, her breath pluming in the dead air. She brought it to the back porch and dumped it. Trip 1. She needed to make at least 100 trips. But as she stood on the porch feeling the icy draft leaking through the weather stripping of the back door, a secondary realization hit her, one that would ultimately save her life. Even if she piled all the wood on the porch, the cabin itself was too big. The living room had vaulted ceilings, heat rises. The wood stove would furiously burn through her supply, trying to heat the empty dead air in the rafters, while the freezing drafts coming through the thin, poorly insulated walls would counteract the warmth. She didn't just need the wood inside. She needed to change the geometry of the house. Winter had given her one day, just one. And Cora Hemsley decided she wasn't just going to store her firewood. She was going to build a fortress with it. By 2 p.m., the first flakes began to fall. They weren't light dancing crystals. They were heavy, dense granules of ice that hit the metal roof with the sound of spilling sand. The wind began to pick up a low, guttural moan filtering through the Douglas firs. Inside the cabin, Cora was running entirely on adrenaline and the raw animal terror of impending death. The living room looked like a lumberyard had exploded. She had abandoned the sled after 2 hours. It was too slow. She had driven her Subaru in reverse across the frozen lawn, backing the trunk right up to the shed, loading it full, driving it to the porch, and throwing the wood directly through the open back door. Her hands were a mess of splinters and bleeding knuckles. Her lower back screamed with every pivot and lift, but the cold was accelerating. The thermometer on the porch had dropped from 28 degrees to 12 degrees in less than an hour. Now came the engineering. Cora cleared the furniture from the center of the living room, pushing the sofa and bookshelves against the far windows, sacrificing the outer edges of the room to the cold. She took a heavy canvas tarp and draped it over a rope she strung from the loft railing down to the opposite wall, effectively lowering the ceiling of the room from 15 feet down to 7. She had created a tent inside the living room, centered directly over the cast-iron wood stove. Then she began to stack. Instead of piling the wood in a corner, she used the logs to build actual walls. She started about 4 feet away from the stove, stacking the tamarack and fir logs tightly against one another, interlocking the corners, just like a miniature log cabin. She built a solid wall of dense wood 2 feet thick and 6 feet high, enclosing a small 8x8 square around the stove and a small mattress she had dragged from the bedroom. The physics of her desperate design were brilliant. Firewood is incredibly dense. By surrounding the stove with thick walls of stacked timber, she was creating a massive thermal battery. The heat from the stove would blast into the wood walls. The wood would absorb the heat trap it within the small enclosure and slowly radiate it back into her tiny jury-rigged bunker. Furthermore, the 2-foot-thick walls of solid timber would act as an impenetrable barrier against the drafty, freezing air of the larger cabin. By 5 p.m., the darkness outside was absolute. The power grid failed with a sharp pop from the transformer, down the mountain, plunging the cabin into pitch blackness. Cora lit a kerosene lantern. Outside, the storm had escalated into a deafening roar. The wind battered the cabin with such ferocity that the floorboards trembled beneath her boots. The snow was already piling against the windows, a rising white tide swallowing the house. She placed the last log onto the top of her interior wall. She had enclosed herself entirely, leaving only a narrow, zigzagging gap to crawl through to reach the kitchen for water in the bathroom. She crawled into her wooden cocoon, sealed the entrance with a heavy wool blanket, and struck a match to light the kindling inside the stove. The fire caught quickly. Within 20 minutes, the iron stove was ticking and expanding with heat. Cora sat on her mattress, her body trembling violently, not from the cold, but from sheer muscular exhaustion. She watched the thermometer she had hung on the inside of her wood wall. Outside her bunker in the main cabin, the temperature was already plummeting, reading a bitter 35 degrees and dropping fast as the storm sucked the warmth through the walls. But inside her wooden fortress beneath the lowered canvas ceiling, the temperature began to climb. 50 degrees. 60. An hour later, The thermometer rested at a balmy 74 degrees. The walls of stacked tamarack were warm to the touch, absorbing the violent heat of the stove and holding it close. The heavy aroma of pine resin, wood smoke, and drying bark filled the tiny space. The roar of the blizzard outside was muffled by the thick acoustic barrier of the logs. Cora lay back on the mattress, tears of exhaustion cutting through the soot on her face. She was encased in a fortress of her own making. The winter was screaming outside, desperately trying to find her to freeze the blood in her veins, but she had outsmarted it. She stacked her firewood inside her walls, and as the worst storm in a century raged outside, Cora Hemsley unzipped her heavy jacket and fell into a deep, warm sleep. She believed she had won, but nature wasn't her only enemy. She had forgotten the golden rule of the wilderness: warmth in a freezing world is a beacon, and beacons attract desperate things. For 3 days the storm did not relent. It was a whiteout so absolute that when Cora peered through her blanket door into the main cabin, she saw that the exterior windows were entirely blocked by snow. The cabin was buried. She was living in a submarine at the bottom of a frozen ocean. Inside her bunker, life was a surreal, monotonous routine of survival. She fed the stove every 3 hours. She melted snow. She scraped from the kitchen window for water. She ate cold MRE's meals ready to eat that Arthur had stockpiled in the pantry, bringing them back into her warm nest to consume. The temperature inside the main cabin had dropped to an astonishing 4 degrees above zero. The water in the toilet bowl had frozen solid, cracking the porcelain. Frost coated the inside of the cabin's drywall like a creeping fungus. But inside her 8x8 fortress of wood, it was a steady, life-sustaining 68 degrees. It was the afternoon of the 4th day when the sounds changed. The wind had been a constant high-pitched shriek. But as Cora sat reading a paperback by the light of the kerosene lantern, she heard a sound that sent a spike of ice-cold adrenaline straight into her heart. Thud, thud, thud. It wasn't the erratic battering of a loose branch. It was rhythmic, intentional. It was coming from the front porch. Cora froze, her breath catching in her throat. She lived 14 miles up a sheer logging road. The snow was easily 6 feet deep. No vehicle could possibly make it up here. No snowmobile could navigate the drifts. Thud, thud, thud. "Hello!" a voice screamed. It was faint, heavily muffled by the snow and the thick walls, but unmistakably human. A man's voice, shredded and desperate. Cora's heart hammered against her ribs. She grabbed the heavy steel flashlight, pushed aside the wool blanket, and crawled out of her warm bunker into the brutal cold of the main living room. Her breath instantly turned to thick white vapor. She crept toward the front door. "Who is it?" she shouted, her voice echoing in the freezing, hollow room. "Cora, it's David Caldwell." The voice was frantic, accompanied by violent pounding. "Please open the door. We're freezing to death. David Caldwell." Cora knew the name. He and his wife Brenda lived in a larger, newer log home about 2 miles down the ridge. They were casual acquaintances. Arthur used to buy fresh eggs from them. Cora didn't hesitate. "You don't leave people to die in the cold." She unbolted the deadbolt and yanked the heavy door inward. The sight was horrific. David and Brenda practically fell into the entryway, accompanied by an avalanche of loose snow. They were covered head to toe in white, their faces blue and raw eyelashes caked in thick ice. Brenda was weeping silently, her body shaking with violent, uncontrollable spasms, the late stages of hypothermia. Cora slammed the door shut against the howling wind and locked it. Get inside the wood wall," she ordered, helping drag Brenda toward the center of the room. She pushed them through the narrow gap into her heated bunker. The transition was shocking for them. Brenda collapsed onto the mattress, gasping as the 70-degree air hit her frozen lungs. David knelt beside the stove, holding his bare, blackened hands dangerously close to the iron. "How did you make it 2 miles?" Cora asked, pouring a thermos of warm water she kept on the stove into a cup and handing it to Brenda. "Snowshoes!" David croaked, his eyes wide and darting around the small enclosure. Took us 6 hours. Our roof, A massive pine came down on day 2, smashed right through the living room. Wind blew all the heat out. We had no choice. Cora nodded sympathetically. You're safe now. I have enough wood to last a month. I have food. But as the color began to return to David's face, Cora noticed something that made the hairs on her arms stand up. David wasn't looking at her with gratitude. He was calculating. His eyes darted over the thick walls of stacked wood, the neatly arranged boxes of MREs, the large water jugs, and finally they landed on Cora. The frantic, desperate energy of a freezing man was fading, replaced by a cold, hardened stare. "You built this yourself?" he asked, his voice dropping, its panicked pitch becoming low and uncomfortably steady. "Yes," Cora said, taking a subtle half-step back toward the gap in the wall. "Arthur was a prepper, wasn't he?" David asked slowly, rubbing his thawing hands together. "He told me once he had 3 months of food up here, a generator out back." "The generator is frozen," Cora lied instinctively. She didn't know why, but every survival alarm in her head was screaming. David slowly stood up within the cramped space. He was a large man, well over 6 feet, and in the tiny 8x8 room, his presence was suddenly suffocating. He reached under his heavy snow parka. When his hand emerged, he was holding a heavy black revolver. He didn't point it at her immediately. He held it casually at his side, letting the heavy steel rest against his leg. "I'm sorry, Cora," David said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "But Brenda needs a place to recover. And this space, it's too small for 3 people. The air will get bad. The food will run out faster." Brenda sat up, looking at her husband with hollow, dead eyes. She didn't protest. She didn't say a word. The horrifying twist hit Cora like a physical blow. They hadn't just come here seeking shelter. 2 miles on snowshoes in a historic blizzard was a suicide mission unless you knew exactly what was waiting for you. David knew Arthur's supplies were here. He knew Cora was alone. He had made a cold, calculated decision back at his ruined home. He was going to hike through the apocalypse to take Cora's life so he could steal hers. Winter had forced Cora to build a fortress. Now she was trapped inside it with a killer. The heavy black Smith & Wesson Model 686 revolver hung from David's hand like a pendulum. In the cramped 80-degree heat of the Firewood bunker, the smell of melting snow on his coat mixed with the sharp metallic tang of fear. Cora's mind, trained to analyze load-bearing walls, structural stress, and catastrophic failure, immediately went to work on the most complex puzzle she had ever faced, the psychology of a desperate man. David wasn't a career criminal. He was a retired high school biology teacher. He was a man who grew tomatoes in the summer and helped plow the county roads in the winter. But the polar vortex had stripped away the thin veneer of civilization. His home was destroyed, his wife was dying, and his brain had reverted to the primal reptilian imperative, survive at all costs. "David," Cora said, keeping her voice incredibly soft, deliberately devoid of sharp edges, "you pull that trigger in here. The acoustic concussion inside this tight space will rupture Brenda's eardrums. It will deafen all of us." David blinked, thrown off balance by the clinical nature of her response. He had expected begging. He had expected screaming. He tightened his grip on the handle. "I don't want to shoot you, Cora, but there isn't enough oxygen or food in this box for 3 people to ride out a 10-day blizzard. I'm giving you a choice. Walk out the front door, or I do it here." "If I walk out that door, I am dead in 30 minutes, Cora stated flatly. "I know." His voice cracked a horrifying mixture of guilt and absolute resolve. "I'm sorry, but my wife is going to live." Cora looked at Brenda. The woman was curled into a tight fetal position on the mattress, her eyes vacant, trembling so violently her teeth chattered like castanets. "You haven't thought this through," Cora said, taking a calculated risk. She leaned against the warm wall of tamarack logs, crossing her arms to hide her own shaking. "You think this is just a pile of wood around a stove. It's an engineered thermal mass. It requires maintenance. The draft is unbalanced. Do you see the damper control on the back of the iron?" David's eyes flicked to the heavy cast-iron stove. "What about it?" Arthur installed a custom secondary combustion baffle. Cora lied smoothly, weaving technical jargon together to build a wall of confusion. Because we're burning unseasoned fur. Mixed with the tamarack, the creosote buildup in the upper flue is exponential. Every 6 hours, the external pipe in the main cabin has to be manually cleared with a wire brush or the draft reverses. If you don't know the exact calibration, this stove will backdraft carbon monoxide into this enclosed space. You and Brenda will fall asleep and never wake up. David stared at her, his jaw tight. He was a biology teacher, not a chimney sweep. He didn't know enough about wood stoves to call her bluff, and the terrifying prospect of suffocating his wife after marching 2 miles to save her paralyzed his trigger finger. "Show me," David commanded. "I can't show you. It's a feeling. You have to listen to the pitch of the airflow," Cora countered, stepping into the narrow zigzag opening of the bunker. "If you kill me or throw me out into the snow, you are signing both of your death warrants by tomorrow morning." David hesitated, the heavy gun trembling slightly. The logic was poisoned, but he had to swallow it. "Fine," he breathed, his eyes hardening into dark slits. "You stay alive, but not in here." He gestured with the barrel toward the freezing expanse of the main cabin. "Out." Cora didn't argue. She squeezed through the gap in the logs, leaving the balmy 70-degree sanctuary. The moment she stepped into the main living room, the cold hit her like a physical assault. The temperature out here had dropped further as the storm raged on. The thermometer on the far wall read 2 degrees above zero. David followed her out, pulling a package of heavy-duty nylon zip ties from his backpack supplies he had brought specifically to secure Arthur's non-existent prepper stash. "Hands behind the structural post," he ordered, gesturing to the massive rough-hewn cedar trunk that supported the loft directly next to the kitchen island. Cora wrapped her arms around the freezing wood. David secured her wrists tightly, the plastic teeth biting viciously into her skin. He then tossed a thin, reflective mylar emergency blanket over her shoulders. "If the stove acts up, you tell me how to fix it," David said, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "If you try to scream, or if you try to get free, I will come out here and put a bullet in your head. Do you understand?" "Yes," Cora whispered. David backed away, retreating into the warm, glowing mouth of the bunker. He pulled the heavy wool blanket shut across the entrance. Cora was alone in the dark, tethered to a post as the temperature plummeted toward zero. The mathematics of her situation were brutal and undeniable. A human being at rest in near-zero temperatures, even with a mylar blanket, will succumb to severe hypothermia in less than 3 hours. She didn't have days to figure out a plan. She had minutes. The first stage of freezing to death is violently physical. The body realizes its core temperature is dropping and triggers severe, uncontrollable shivering, a desperate biological mechanism to generate friction and heat within the muscles. Cora's teeth clicked together so hard she feared they would shatter. The mylar blanket crinkled aggressively with every spasm, doing little more than reflecting her rapidly diminishing body heat back onto her trembling shoulders. An hour passed. The pain in her fingers and toes transitioned from an agonizing burn to a terrifying, dull numbness. Frostbite was setting in. The moisture in her breath was freezing to her eyelashes, blurring her vision in the ambient gloom cast by the snow-covered windows. She could hear David and Brenda inside the bunker, the muffled sounds of a tin can opening, the crackle of the wood fire, the soft murmur of David comforting his wife. They were stealing her warmth. They were stealing her life. Engineers do not panic, Arthur used to tell her. They identify the failure point and apply leverage. Cora closed her eyes, forcing her panicked mind to focus on the structure around her. Her hands were zip-tied behind the cedar post. The post was rough-hewn, meaning the bark had been mechanically stripped off 30 years ago, leaving jagged ridges and deep grooves in the hardened wood. She began to move her bound wrists up and down against the back of the post. The thick nylon of the zip ties rubbed against the coarse cedar. At first, it just shredded the skin on her forearm, sending hot streaks of pain through her frozen limbs. She gritted her teeth, ignoring the warm trickle of blood sliding down her palms, and focused on the friction. Up, down, up, down. It was agonizingly slow. The cold was moving into its second stage. The violent shivering began to subside, replaced by a profound, heavy lethargy. This was the danger zone. Her brain was slowly cooling, her cognitive functions sluggish. A voice in the back of her head, sweet and seductive, whispered that if she just closed her eyes and rested for 5 minutes, the pain would stop. No! She slammed the back of her head against the post to jolt herself awake. Up, down, up, down. After another 45 minutes of grueling, repetitive motion, the friction generated enough heat and abrasion against a particularly sharp knot in the cedar. With a sharp snap, the thick plastic tie broke. Cora fell forward onto the frozen hardwood floor, her arms completely dead, hanging limply at her sides like heavy clubs. She lay there for 3 minutes, letting the blood agonizingly force its way back into her constricted capillaries. Every nerve ending in her hands screamed in protest, feeling as though they were being pierced by thousands of hot needles. She slowly pushed herself up. She was free, but she was functionally dying. The air temperature in the room was now 0. Her core temperature was dangerously low. If she didn't get heat within the next 20 minutes, her heart would enter arrhythmia. She looked toward the bunker. The wool blanket was drawn tight. She couldn't fight David. Even if she had a weapon, her hands were so numb she couldn't grip it, and she lacked the physical strength to swing it. She had to force him to come to her, and she had to blind him in the process. She needed to make the stove backdraft, not as a bluff, but as a reality. Cora crept silently toward the stairs leading to the loft. Her joints popped and ground together in the cold. She ascended the wooden steps, her socks making no sound. The loft overlooked the main living room, situated directly above the canvas tarp that formed the roof of her bunker. Rising through the center of the loft, straight up to the vaulted ceiling, was the 8-inch double-walled black stovepipe that exhausted the wood stove smoke outside. Because it was double-walled, it was warm to the touch, but not blistering hot. About chest-high on the pipe was the manual flue damper, a metal lever that controlled the airflow. When parallel to the pipe, the chimney was wide open, creating the powerful updraft that pulled the smoke out of the cabin. Cora grabbed the metal handle. Her hands were clumsy, her fingers unresponsive blocks of ice. She had to use the heels of both hands to push the stiff lever. With a soft, metallic screech, she turned the damper a full 90 degrees until it was perfectly perpendicular to the pipe. She had just slammed the door shut on the fire's exhaust. Down below, inside the airtight, heavily insulated bunker of stacked firewood, a raging fire was rapidly consuming oxygen. With the chimney blocked, the intense heat and immense volume of toxic wood smoke had absolutely nowhere to go but out the front vents of the cast-iron stove directly into the 8x8 living space. Cora silently retreated down the stairs. She moved to the kitchen, her eyes scanning the dark for an advantage. She found it by the cast-iron sink, the heavy iron fireplace poker she had left on the counter 2 days ago. She clamped both frozen hands around the cold metal shaft. She couldn't feel her grip, but she locked her wrists. She positioned herself in the darkest corner of the room, 10 feet from the bunker's entrance, and waited. The physics of the trap had been set. Now the thermodynamics would do the rest. It took exactly 4 minutes for the reality of the closed damper to manifest inside the bunker. First came the sound of violent coughing, a deep hacking noise that tore through the thick walls of stacked tamarack. Then Brenda's voice, a weak, panicked wheeze. "David, I can't. My eyes!" Or, "What the hell?" David's voice was thick with sudden panic. The stove. It's pouring smoke. Inside the tiny enclosure, the situation was rapidly becoming lethal. A large wood stove, when entirely choked off from its draft, does not just smoke. It billows thick, acrid, blinding clouds of gray creosote-laced exhaust. Within seconds, the oxygen levels in the 8x8 space would plummet, replacing breathable air with heavy carbon monoxide and particulate matter. "Cora!" David screamed, his voice muffled by the wood and his own choking. "Cora, the damper, fix it, fix the damned damper." Cora stood perfectly still in the freezing shadows, the heavy iron poker raised to her shoulder. Her breath hung in the air like a frozen ghost. She did not make a sound. "Cora!" The panic inside the bunker escalated into a violent scramble, the sound of wood shifting, the dull thud of a body hitting the floor. The smoke was suffocating them. David had no choice. The bunker, their stolen sanctuary, had instantly transformed into a gas chamber. Suddenly, the heavy wool blanket covering the bunker's entrance was torn violently aside. What happened next was a chaotic display of atmospheric physics. The bunker had been holding a temperature of 80 degrees, pressurized with dense hot smoke. The main cabin was hovering at 0 degrees, filled with dry, freezing air. When David ripped the blanket open, the hot, smoky air rushed out to equalize with the freezing void of the cabin. The sudden violent collision of extreme heat and extreme cold caused the moisture in the hot air to condense instantaneously. A massive, thick wall of white, blinding fog exploded out of the bunker, rolling across the cabin floor like a tidal wave mingling with the dark gray wood smoke. David stumbled through the narrow gap, choking violently, his eyes streaming with tears, absolutely blinded by both the acrid smoke and the sudden dense condensation fog that filled the room. He held the Smith & Wesson blindly in front of him, waving it through the whiteout. "Cora, where are you?" he roared, coughing so hard he dropped to one knee. The freezing air hit his sweat-soaked clothes, sending a violent shock through his system. He couldn't see past the end of his gun. He was completely disoriented in the freezing mist. Cora moved. She didn't run. She glided through the fog, using her intimate knowledge of the cabin's layout. She knew exactly where the dining table was, exactly where the rug ended, exactly where David had dropped to his knee. She stepped out of the freezing vapor directly beside him. David heard the creak of the floorboard, but his eyes were clamped shut against the biting smoke. He swung the heavy revolver toward the sound. Cora didn't aim for his head. She was an engineer. She aimed for the structural weak point. She swung the heavy iron fireplace poker downward with every ounce of desperate freezing strength she had left in her body, bringing it down squarely on David's right wrist. The sickening crack of bone echoed sharply in the empty room. David unleashed a guttural scream of absolute agony. His fingers instantly went limp, and the heavy Smith & Wesson dropped to the floorboard, sliding away into the fog. Before he could react, before he could stand, Cora swung again. This time, she brought the heavy iron shaft up, catching him under the jaw. The blow wasn't lethal, but it was enough to short-circuit his brain for a crucial second. David's eyes rolled back, and he collapsed sideways onto the frozen floor, his large body going completely slack. Silence rushed back into the room, broken only by the howling wind outside and the weak, terrifying sounds of Brenda gagging inside the smoke-filled bunker. Cora stood over David, her chest heaving, the iron poker trembling in her numb hands. She was running on the last fumes of adrenaline. Her body temperature was critically low. The edges of her vision were going dark. She knew she had less than 5 minutes before she passed out from the cold. She kicked David's heavy boots, ensuring he was truly unconscious. Then she fell to her hands and knees and frantically searched the floorboards until her frozen fingers brushed against the cold steel of the revolver. She picked it up, tucking it into the waistband of her pants. She crawled toward the bunker entrance. The smoke was still pouring out thick and lethal. She held her breath, squeezed her eyes shut, and dragged herself through the gap in the hot logs. Inside, it was a blinding, suffocating hell. She felt blindly until her hands met Brenda's coat. The woman was unconscious, slumped against the mattress. Cora grabbed the collar of Brenda's jacket and, using the last reserves of her strength, dragged the woman backward out of the bunker and into the freezing air of the main cabin. Cora left them both on the floor. She scrambled up the loft stairs, her vision swimming with gray spots. She reached the stovepipe and violently threw the damper lever back open, aligning it with the pipe. Down below, the effect was immediate. A massive rush of cold air was sucked into the bunker as the chimney's draft caught. With a loud whoosh, the wood stove began drawing properly again, violently sucking the thick smoke out of the room and venting it out into the blizzard. Cora staggered back down the stairs. The fog was beginning to settle. The bunker was clearing. The heat radiating from the open gap was a siren song calling to her dying, freezing body. She looked at David groaning on the floor, clutching his shattered wrist. She looked at Brenda unconscious, but breathing the clear, freezing air. Cora had the gun. She had won back her sanctuary. But the winter had given her a terrifying prize. She was now the absolute master of who lived and who died in the freezing dark. She pointed the heavy revolver at David as he slowly blinked awake. his face twisting in pain and sudden dawning terror. "Get up," Cora croaked, her voice barely a whisper through her chattering teeth, "and drag your wife into the corner." The main living room was a frozen purgatory settling aggressively at 4 degrees below zero. David Caldwell clutched his shattered right wrist against his chest, his breath coming in ragged, steaming gasps. His eyes watering from the lingering smoke, and the agonizing pain remained locked on the black barrel of the Smith & Wesson in Cora's steady hand. "Move," Cora commanded again, her voice stripped of any remaining empathy. It was the flat, dead tone of a warden. David didn't argue. With his good arm, he grabbed Brenda by the collar of her heavy parka and dragged her across the frost-slicked hardwood floor, settling her into the far corner of the room near the cold, dead hearth of the original stone fireplace. Cora backed slowly into the entryway of her thermal bunker. The heat pouring out of the gap was intoxicating a physical wave of salvation, but she couldn't simply retreat and close the door. If she left them out there on the bare floor, they would be dead in 3 hours. She was an engineer, not an executioner. Leaving them to freeze was a passive murder she could not stomach, but letting them back into her secure zone was suicide. She had to engineer a secondary environment, a demilitarized zone. Keeping the gun leveled at David, Cora reached into her bunker and dragged out 2 thick, heavy-duty synthetic sleeping bags Arthur had bought for elk hunting. She threw them across the room. They landed at David's boots. Next, she grabbed a thick canvas tarp and tossed it toward him. "Hang that over the stone mantel and pull it over yourselves," she instructed. "It will trap your body heat inside a smaller footprint. Do not take your boots off. Keep your hands in your armpits." David stared at the sleeping bags, then at her. The reality of his failure was settling into his features, replacing his predatory desperation with a hollow, crushing defeat. "My wrist," he whispered, his teeth clacking together. "The bone I think it's splintered. I can feel it grinding." Cora reached into the bunker one last time and retrieved the orange plastic first aid kit. She slid it across the floor. "There are chemical heat packs in there. Snap them, put them in Brenda's sleeping bag. There are also hydrocodone pills and a fiberglass splint. You're a biology teacher. You know how to set it. Do it yourself." "Cora, please," David begged, his voice breaking into a pathetic whine. "It's 0 degrees out here. We can't survive in this corner." "You hiked 2 miles to murder a widow and steal her shelter," Cora replied, the words dropping like stones on frozen glass. "You will stay under that tarp. If you step out from beneath it, if you approach this wall, I will not aim for your wrist. Do we have an understanding?" David looked at the heavy revolver, then down at his unconscious wife. He nodded slowly. Cora retreated into her fortress. She pulled the heavy wool blanket tight across the entrance, sealing herself back into the balmy 70-degree sanctuary. She collapsed onto her mattress, the gun resting heavily on her sternum. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the violent confrontation evaporated, leaving behind a profound, terrifying exhaustion. Outside her wooden walls, she heard the sickening wet crunch of David, forcing his shattered radius bone back into alignment, followed by a muffled, agonizing scream. Then silence returned, save for the eternal shrieking wind of the polar vortex. For the next 48 hours, an uneasy, terrifying truce settled over the cabin. Cora maintained a ruthless schedule. She slept in 2-hour increments, waking to feed the stove and check the perimeter. Every 6 hours, she pushed a heavy cast-iron skillet filled with warm melted snow and heated MREs under the gap in the blanket, pushing it across the floor with the iron poker. She never exposed her full body. She never put down the gun. Brenda regained consciousness on the 5th day of the storm. Cora heard the confused, panicked weeping through the walls. She heard David whispering frantically, explaining the lie he had concocted, that Cora had gone crazy, that she was hoarding the heat, entirely omitting his attempt to hold her at gunpoint. Cora let them lie. The truth didn't matter in the dark. The only thing that mattered was thermodynamics. But as the storm dragged into its 6th day, a new, much more terrifying sound began to manifest. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the freezing prisoners. It was a sound that made Cora's blood run completely cold. It was a deep, resonant groan, like the hull of a massive wooden ship buckling under the pressure of the deep ocean. It came from directly above her. The blizzard had dumped an estimated 90 inches of heavy, wet Pacific snow onto the Idaho panhandle. Cora knew the mathematics of a snow load intimately. A single cubic foot of compacted wet snow weighs approximately 20 pounds. The cabin's roof was a simple pitched A-frame design built in the late 1970s with rough-hewn timber. It had a surface area of roughly 1,200 square feet. Cora stared up at the canvas tarp that formed the ceiling of her bunker, doing the terrifying mental calculations. 1,200 square feet holding an average of 7 feet of compacted snow. That equated to roughly 160,000 pounds of dead weight pressing down on the cabin's ridge beam. 80 tons of frozen water. At 2 a.m. on the seventh night, the cabin didn't just groan, it screamed. A sharp explosive crack echoed through the space so loud and violent it sounded like a shotgun discharging inside the living room. Dust and dead pine needles rained down from the vaulted ceiling, pattering against Cora's canvas tarp. Cora scrambled out of her sleeping bag, grabbing the flashlight and the revolver. She pushed through the blanket entrance and swept the beam of light upward. The temperature in the main cabin was still holding at a lethal 0 degrees. Across the room, David and Brenda poked their heads out from beneath their makeshift canvas tent, their faces pale with terror. "What was that?" David shouted, his breath forming a thick cloud. Cora ignored him. She trained the high-powered beam onto the massive 20-foot horizontal timber beam that ran the length of the cabin's vaulted ceiling, the central spine of the roof. Her heart dropped into her stomach. Exactly in the middle of the span, right above the center of the living room, the massive wooden beam had bowed inward. It was a severe deflection, easily sagging 4 inches. Even worse, a deep, jagged fissure had opened along the underside of the wood, exposing the raw, splintered heartwood inside. "The structural integrity is failing," Cora said loudly, her voice echoing in the freezing space. "The snow load has exceeded the sheer strength of the ridge beam. It's snapping." "Is the roof going to cave in?" Brenda cried out, her voice raw and hoarse. "Yes," Cora stated clinically. "If that beam snaps, 80 tons of snow will crush this house perfectly flat. We will be instantly pulverized." Another sharp, splintering crack echoed through the room. The beam sagged another half-inch. It wasn't a matter of days anymore. It was a matter of minutes. The massive weight of the sky was finally crushing them. Cora's mind raced. In structural engineering, when a horizontal span is failing, you only have one option: introduce a vertical load-bearing column directly beneath the point of failure to transfer the weight to the foundation. She looked at her thermal bunker. It was built of solid seasoned tamarack logs, 2 feet thick, incredibly dense. "David," Cora shouted, turning the flashlight on him, "get out of the bag, now!" "I have a broken arm," he protested, shivering violently as the freezing air hit his face. "I don't care if both your arms are broken. If you don't help me right now, we are all dead," Cora roared, stripping away the calm, calculated demeanor she had maintained for days. She tucked the revolver into her waistband and grabbed the iron poker. "Get over here!" David stumbled out from under his tarp, cradling his splinted right arm. "I have to dismantle the front wall of my bunker," Cora commanded, pointing at the thick wall of stacked firewood. "We are going to take these logs and build a cribbing tower, a solid interlocking square of timber, straight up from the floor to the ceiling, directly under that crack in the beam." Cora didn't wait for his compliance. She began frantically tearing down the fortress she had built to save her own life. She grabbed the heavy logs, dragging them to the center of the room, directly under the failing ridge beam. Stack them in a square, 2 logs parallel, then 2 logs perpendicular on top, just like Lincoln logs. Cora ordered, demonstrating by slamming the first 4 logs onto the frozen hardwood. "We are building a solid pier." Despite his agonizing injury, terror motivated David. He used his left arm and his chest to awkwardly lift and carry the heavy timber. The freezing temperature of the main room immediately began to assault Cora. Without her heavy jacket, which was inside the bunker, the 0-degree air felt like razor blades slicing through her thin sweater. But the physical exertion of lifting 60-pound logs kept her blood moving. They worked in a frantic, desperate rhythm. Up and up the tower went, 3 feet, 4 feet, crack. The roof groaned again, a horrifying sound of impending doom. Dust showered down on them. "Faster!" Cora screamed. They tore down the entire front half of her sanctuary. The heat from the bunker spilled out and rapidly dissipated into the freezing void of the cabin. She was sacrificing her warmth, her safety, her absolute leverage to stop the sky from falling. By the time the cribbing tower reached 10 feet high, David could no longer lift the logs with one arm. Cora was forced to climb the precarious stacking tower of firewood, balancing precariously as David awkwardly handed the logs up to her. Her hands were bleeding again, the splinters tearing through her calluses. The temperature was draining the life from her muscles. 14 feet. The top of the cribbing tower was now mere inches from the sagging, splintered ridge beam. "Hey! Hand me the oak wedges from the kindling box," Cora shouted down to David. He scrambled, returning with 3 wedge-shaped pieces of hard oak. He tossed them up. Cora caught them. She placed a final flat log across the top of the tower, leaving a gap of about 2 inches between the log and the failing ceiling beam. She inserted the oak wedges into the gap. Then, grabbing the heavy iron fireplace poker she had brought up with her, she used the flat handle as a hammer. She swung wildly, driving the wedges deep into the gap, forcing the cribbing tower upward until it wedged perfectly tightly against the sagging beam. She pounded them in until the wood screamed under the pressure. The cribbing tower was now taking the sheer downward force of the roof, transferring the tens of thousands of pounds of pressure down through the interlocking firewood and straight into the concrete foundation below the floorboards. Cora stopped hammering. She clung to the top of the tower, gasping for air, her lungs burning from the freezing cold. She waited. 10 seconds. A minute. The groaning stopped. The cabin was utterly silent. The makeshift structural column of firewood was holding the weight. Cora slowly climbed down the rough logs, her legs shaking so violently she nearly fell. When her boots hit the floor, she stumbled backward, completely spent. She looked at her bunker. It was ruined. Half the walls were gone, repurposed into the towering column in the center of the room. The enclosed heat had vanished. The temperature in the entire cabin was equalizing at a lethal 5 degrees. She looked at David. He was slumped against the wall, his face gray, clutching his broken arm, staring up at the tower of wood that had just saved their lives. Cora pulled the heavy Smith & Wesson from her waistband. She didn't point it at him. She just held it, staring at the man who had tried to kill her, the man who had just helped her save the roof. "Rebuild the wall," Cora whispered, her voice cracking. David looked at her confused. "What?" "There's enough wood left in the shed pile in the corner. Rebuild the front wall of the bunker," Cora said, her eyes hollow, the adrenaline completely gone. "Make it big enough for 3. The cold had finally broken her isolation. The mathematics of survival had changed. She couldn't maintain the energy to fight him, fight the cold, and fight the house. If they were going to survive the rest of this winter, they had to share the heat. David didn't say a word. He just nodded slowly. For the next 2 hours, working in agonizing silence, the engineer and the man who tried to murder her rebuilt the thermal fortress, enclosing themselves in the unconscious Brenda within a slightly larger 10 by 10 space around the ticking iron stove. When the last log was placed, sealing them in the heat, slowly began to return. Cora sat on the far side of the stove, the gun resting on her lap. David sat opposite her, cradling his wife. They did not speak. They simply stared at the orange glow of the iron enemies locked in a tiny wooden box at the bottom of a frozen sea, waiting for the end of the world. The storm broke on the afternoon of the 9th day. It didn't announce its departure with a sudden burst of brilliant sunlight or a dramatic shift in the barometric pressure. It simply ran out of breath. The relentless shrieking wind that had battered the rough-hewn timber of the cabin for over 200 continuous hours finally died away. What was left in its wake was a silence so absolute, so suffocatingly heavy, it felt like physical pressure pressing against their eardrums. Inside the expanded 10 by 10 firewood bunker, the air had become toxic with stagnation. It smelled intensely of unwashed bodies, dried blood, fierce sweat, and the heavy, acrid bite of continuous wood smoke. For the past 48 hours, the three survivors had existed in a state of purgatorial suspended animation. They communicated only through sharp, necessary grunts and the meticulous, choreographed movements required to feed the cast-iron stove and melt snow for drinking water. Cora sat with the Smith & Wesson resting in her lap, her eyes heavy but never fully closing. David sat opposite her, his shattered right arm bound in a crude fiberglass splint, using his left arm to cradle Brenda, whose breathing had finally stabilized into a weak but steady rhythm. They were no longer predator and prey. They were inmates serving a grueling sentence in a shared wooden cell. When Cora finally pushed a section of the tamarack logs aside and crawled out into the main living room, the temperature was still aggressively freezing, hovering at roughly 2 degrees above zero. Yet the ambient light filtering into the room was blindingly, agonizingly bright. She stumbled on stiff, trembling legs toward the front door. She threw the deadbolt and pulled the handle. It didn't budge a millimeter. The snow was packed solid concrete hard against the exterior. She moved to the kitchen window, scraping away the interior frost with her fingernails. The snowdrift was entirely over the glass. They were entombed. It took them 6 grueling hours to dig their way out. Working together in a silent, exhausted rhythm, Cora and David used aluminum cooking pots and a fireplace shovel to excavate a vertical tunnel upward through the second-story loft window. Every scoop of snow was heavy, wet, and densely packed. David worked until his face drained of color, his broken arm throbbing with a sickening pulse he could feel in his jaw. When Cora's shovel finally broke through the upper crust, the blast of crisp, freezing, oxygen-rich air hit her lungs like a physical blow. She clawed at the opening, widening it enough to pull herself up and out onto the surface of the snow. The world she emerged into was entirely unrecognizable. The massive, towering Douglas firs were buried halfway up their 80-foot trunks. The rugged mountainous terrain had been erased, replaced by a smooth, undulating ocean of blinding white stretching under a piercing, cloudless blue sky. She helped haul David up, who then dragged a weakly coughing Brenda to the surface. They collapsed onto the frozen crust, 3 soot-stained ghosts blinking against the severe glare of the winter sun. 3 hours later, the vast, empty silence was broken by a distant mechanical roar. It was a heavy, guttural diesel engine grinding its way up the invisible buried line of the logging road. Soon, a customized Tucker snowcat, painted bright search and rescue orange, crested the ridge. Standing in the open cab was Sheriff Tom Higgins, his face wrapped in a heavy wool scarf, scanning the apocalyptic landscape through high-powered binoculars. When the massive, 4-treaded machine finally ground to a halt 50 yards from the roof of the cabin, the only part of the structure visible above the snow, Higgins and his deputy, a young man named Miller, scrambled out wearing heavy-duty snowshoes. Cora stood on the edge of the roofline, wrapped tightly in her Carhartt coat, watching them approach. David stood rigidly beside her, his arms strapped tightly against his chest in the makeshift sling, Brenda leaning all of her weight against his good side. Jesus Almighty. Sheriff Higgins breathed, his voice cracking with genuine shock as he reached the roofline. We marked this entire grid sector as a recovery operation. We thought you were all dead. The Caldwell house is flattened completely. Roof caved in on day 3. We made it here, David said. His voice was raspy, barely more than a whisper. Higgins looked at David's crude splint, then at the haggard, feral, soot-stained faces of the 3 survivors. He peered down into the excavated hole, leading into the loft, shining his flashlight into the gloom. He caught a clear glimpse of the massive cribbing tower of firewood stretching from the floorboards up to the fractured ridge beam. You built that support structure? Higgins asked, pulling his scarf down to look at Cora with a mixture of profound awe and disbelief. Yes, Cora said simply. Higgins shook his head slowly. Incredible, absolutely incredible engineering. It's a miracle you people didn't freeze to death or kill each other from the cabin fever. The silence that followed his words was incredibly heavy, laden with a terrifying, violent weight that the sheriff couldn't possibly understand. Cora looked at David. David looked back at her. His eyes held a complex, agonizing mixture of deep shame, lingering terror, and a silent, desperate plea. He knew the mathematics of the law. He knew that if Cora spoke the truth right now, if she told Sheriff Higgins about the heavy revolver, the zip ties, the attempted murder, and the brutal strike of the iron poker, he would spend the rest of his life rotting in a federal penitentiary. The winter had stripped away everything. It had shown Cora exactly what ordinary human beings were capable of when the lights went out, the food ran low, and the freezing cold crept into their bones. David wasn't a monster born of malice. He was a desperate animal acting on the most primal imperative to keep his mate breathing. And she wasn't just an innocent victim. She was a survivor who had coldly engineered a gas chamber and shattered a man's bones to protect her own fire. They were all guilty of surviving, and they were all alive. Arthur left a really good woodpile. Cora finally said, her voice eerily steady, turning her gaze away from David and back to the sheriff. We stacked it inside the living room, built a small box, kept the heat close. David closed his eyes, his shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch as a single hot tear cut a clean track through the thick soot on his cheek. They were loaded into the heated, cramped cabin of the snowcat. As the heavy treads dug into the packed snow, violently pulling them away from the buried cabin, Cora Hemsley didn't look back. She had survived the coldest, deadliest week in a century. She had built an impenetrable fortress, fought off a human predator, and held up the crushing weight of the sky itself. The severe frostbite on her fingers would eventually heal. The splintered ridge beam would be repaired in the spring. But the terrifying knowledge of what she was truly capable of, and the dark, violent lengths to which others would go when the cold set in, would stay perfectly preserved within her mind. Cold, absolute, and unthawing for the rest of her life. Cora's harrowing ordeal in the Idaho wilderness is a chilling testament to the raw, unyielding power of human ingenuity when pushed to the absolute brink. It strips away the romanticism of winter survival, exposing the brutal mathematics of thermodynamics, structural failure, and the terrifying moral compromises we are capable of when our core temperature begins to drop. Her story reminds us that shelter is not just the walls around us, but the psychological fortresses we construct to keep the darkness at bay. It forces us to ask a terrifying question: what would you do if the world went cold and someone knocked on your door to steal your fire? If you were captivated by this incredible true story of survival engineering and psychological warfare, please hit that like button, share this video with your friends to see what they would do in Cora's shoes. And don't forget to subscribe for more gripping tales of human endurance.